Hello and welcome to this lecture on Gender, Political Discourse and Practice, the US case. My name is Dr. Gerard Toal. This lecture is part of the module on Gender, Political Discourse in the course Discourse Analysis. Okay, the readings that I'm going to discuss briefly in this lecture are Robert Dean's essay, Masculinity as Ideology, as well as two essays by Cohn, and then two other essays which deal with the image of the cowboy in a US geopolitical culture. So let's begin by talking about leadership and masculinity and hegemonic masculinity, which we already have addressed in our theoretical lecture. You can think of leadership as a two-level game, which is something that leaders are expected to demonstrate, both internationally and then also domestically. And in both cases, gendered norms inform how leadership is understood and whether leadership is successful or not. And there are constant gendered discourse, gendered symbols, and gendered images circulating around the Constitution and the understanding of the idea of leadership and successful leadership. Now, let's talk first about the move within diplomatic history to address the issue of gender. I have assigned to you the essay by Dean, which is part of his larger book called Imperial Brotherhood. And that essay begins by discussing John F. Kennedy's career as part of an ideology of masculinity. And you can see the section that I've highlighted there. I want to draw your attention to the fact that this particular essay is one that is part of a larger cultural turn within cultural turn towards gender in diplomatic history. So some of the key essays are listed in footnote 2, and I want to draw your attention in particular to the essay that is written, listed there by Scott, as well as the essays by Frank Costigliola. And his work, there's a series of essays by him where he's tried to look at the whole issue of gender and masculine identity in the practice of statecraft, in leadership. And so how forms of socialization into particular identities and particular visions of manhood, in the case of Kennedy, that American upper class notion of manhood, which was forged out of specific patterns of ordeals of the boarding school, of nature, of combat, and so on and so forth, how they then shape masculinity and the leader's sense of himself. Now, this, of course, is more than simply the individual sense of himself. It has to do with the society writ large and the presentation of oneself as a successful and a leader who is vigorous and who is strong. So in this particular slide here, you can see Kennedy with the women that worked in the White House, most of whom were secretaries at that time, and there was a strong gender division of labor. You can, in reading Dean's essay, you'll look at the importance of the boarding school, as well as fears of homosexuality and how scares about homosexuality were important in the McCarthyite time in the 1950s. Then he discusses the book The Ugly American and the idea of counterinsurgency. And I've also included a slide here of Sergeant Shriver, who was the person who Kennedy tapped to be the leader of the Peace Corps. Let's move to the essays by Cohn. And she's coming out of a women's studies background, so it's different from diplomatic history. But she presents us with two fascinating articles which detail her analysis of defense intellectuals, Cold War defense complex. And I have just included in this particular slide Herman Kahn with Donald Rumsfeld and Gerald Ford. Herman Kahn was one of the kind of classic defense intellectuals thinking about a nuclear war and theorizing nuclear war. Curtis LeMay, who was the general from World War II that then headed up the Strategic Air Command, the group that had "Peace is our profession" as their slogan. And then the early Cold War and how nuclear weapons and the danger of radiation was not that well known. And below I've just included some images from the 1964 movie Dr. Strangelove, which is a satire on the Cold War defense complex. And I include that because what I want to do is I want you to think critically about the hegemonic masculinities here, and then how they begin to become objects of humor, and how they begin to lose some of their power. Even though they still may be hegemonic, but there's sort of resistance within the culture to them. So, Cohn's essay from 1987, Sex and Death in the World of Defense Intellectuals, is a fabulous essay. And you can see that she takes an anthropological stance towards this community, and she discusses the power of technoscientific language, the way in which it abstracts, disembodies the particular users from the actual weapons that they're being discussed. And it's a language of users, not victims, of a priesthood, not of ordinary people. And she enumerates the different euphemisms, the unconscious sexualized language, the domesticating language, the expertise, and the like. Now, she doesn't explicitly talk about hegemonic masculinity, but she is describing a sort of cool, rational masculinity of the defense intellectual. I've summarized here a series of points which I think are very important in this essay about the implications of the techno-scientific discourse that she describes and its weapons-centric language. So there's no way to talk about human deaths in societies. It's illegitimate to ask this particular way of thinking. She calls it a paradigm, a symbolic system, to reflect on human concerns. It's a discourse which is hermetically sealed. It's a language seen as representing a truth independent of any other truth or knowledge. And she makes a very important point about the isolation of this technical knowledge from social, psychological, moral thought and feelings. She argues technoscience has become virtually the only legitimate form of response to questions as to how we achieve security in our society. Perhaps overstated, but at that time, maybe not. And then she actually argues that if you push it further, this techno-scientific discourse in and of itself is a hegemonic masculinity. It's the hegemonic masculinity of the rational defense intellectual. But it functions as a legitimation for political outcomes that have occurred for utterly different reasons and which involve questions of gender and of irrationalities of various kinds. The context of her second essay is the Gulf War of 1991 and the presidency of George Herbert Walker Bush, who was tarred with being a wimp at one stage after following on the footsteps from Reagan, and the Gulf War of early 1991 sort of overcame that, and it was a moment of seen reassertionism on the part of the United States, a moment of glory in the international stage, and followed on with parades of various sorts. And here you have a slide on that. So she is revisiting the same work, the anthropological work that she did, and she's talking about, and it's a sort of a reflection on some of the same themes, but how gender discourse is a symbolic system. And she uses a very nice turn of phrase that gender discourse is a preemptive deterrent. So she's using the language of technoscience itself to try to describe it. It's a preemptive deterrent to certain kinds of thought. And so, I would encourage you to think about it in terms of hegemonic masculinity and its particular anxieties, particularly the anxieties over masculinity and whether one is acting like a wimp or whether one is being a woman or being feminine. And she describes it as an interpretive symbolic system, one of codes. She uses the term codes. And then she wants to argue that this particular discourse has certain policing functions, and the gender codes have policing functions. And think about it in terms of when leaders are described as weak, as ineffective, as dithering. That's another way in which this language comes to the fore. And she makes a very, very important point at the end about the unitary masculine actor, the ways in which international crises are turned into personalized male-on-male standoffs between Obama on the one hand and Putin on the other, Bush versus Saddam Hussein, and so on and so forth. And the major problems with that in what is written out when you create this presumption of singular coherent masculine adversary. And I think there's a lot of very, very valuable points in this essay concerning that. Then we will turn to the issue of the cowboy and the cowboy imagery surrounding Bush's son, W. And there are two essays which address that. The first essay is one that comes out of sociology, Cowboy of the World, Gender Discourse and the Iraq War Debate. And this is a sort of word count analysis of the coverage of the Iraq War debate, in which gender is one of the ways in which that debate is framed. And they very effectively demonstrate how the language of gender and gender images lower the quality of the debate. They force binaries and dichotomies onto what is a much more complex reality. So that essay is very, very useful. And then the second essay, which is not as strong in certain ways, but I included it nevertheless, by Karen Hoffman, Visual Persuasion, George W. Bush's Presidency. This comes out of presidential studies, but it taps into the notion that the imagery of the cowboy and how that functioned in George W. Bush's presidency is actually a complicated matter. And this also comes out in Christensen and Ferre's essay too, is the ways in which this is a masculinity which is hegemonic for certain groups, yet also it's very easy to make fun of. And it's something that has to be pulled off, but may not be pulled off in the most effective way. So that what you're seeing is constant performances of masculinity, but those performances themselves may be undermining to certain constituencies domestically, and then also constituencies internationally. So we have to look at the ways in which you have a hegemony which is not ever fully consolidated. It's constantly being undermined and challenged. So here are some further readings on these particular themes. Susan Jeffords' work on films and Vietnam, the whole theme of the remasculinization of America. Kristen Hodgson's book on the Spanish-American and also the Philippine-American War and how gender politics played into that. Gibson's book on post-Vietnam America and the rise of militias. And then Gusterson's book on a nuclear weapons lab and the techno-scientific discourse, also an anthropological study.